Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Random Class. For this week I will be talking more about history, about some misconceptions and misunderstandings from World War II. So let's start with who attacked first. And we all learned that it was Germany, but actually Japan did attack Manchuria 8 years before the attack on Poland. And in Europe, it was actually Italy who attacked first when they attacked Ethiopia in Africa, where they did use gas and other nasty stuff from World War I on a poor nation. And we all believe the first nation to have been taken over from Germany is Poland, but actually it was Austria. And we tend to forget them because they were about to vote if they wanted to join Germany, but before the votes were counted in, Hitler actually sent his troops into the country, thereby making it occupied and him taking over the country. And if you're sitting there thinking, why are you telling me this? Well, it's important. History is important, since it's how we see ourselves, our country, and how we build our future. But back to the history. So the next thing is Poland. When the Germans did enter Poland, they had made a fake attack, making it look like the Poles had actually attacked Germany to try and convince the rest of the world that it was okay for them to attack them. And a lot of people do believe that Poland was just run over, and it's actually not true. They did fight back hard, and the Germans did take losses that they didn't count on. They did lose a great number of tanks to Polish anti-tank guns. Also, there's a myth about a Polish cavalry unit charging at tanks, but apparently it didn't happen. I believe that it happened for a long time until I found evidence that it didn't. And when the Russians attacked the Poles from the other side, that was basically the nail in the coffin for the Polish forces. And the fact that the British and French didn't move into Germany, even though they promised to help Poland. And speaking of Poland, not many know, but the Germans went in to kill the Polish resistance when they rise up in the end of the war. And they rose up because the Soviets told them, rise up and we will come to help you. And then the Russians did nothing. But the Germans did send in a special squad that leveled the entire city, made it a pile of ruins. So if you go to see Warsaw today, all the stuff that is built up is from old pictures they had of the city, and then they tried to rebuild it. And speaking of France, everyone believed them to surrender all the time, because they do for some reason. And it's not true. France have still won more battles than any other Europe nation. But it is true that France did fall faster than we believed them to be. But the generals and leaders who were in control of the army basically made every mistake they were able to do. But the French did fight with valor and bravery, and were it not for them buying time at Dunkirk, the evacuation might not have ended as well as it did. Also, it did help that Hitler made the army stop. And we do tend to believe that the German army was full of tanks and mechanized units, but that is also not true. Only a small faction of the army actually had all that equipment. The rest was still using horses and their own feet to get around. But speaking of tanks, I would ask all of you to actually try and Google the Ghost Division, because it's a fascinating story about how some Germans were able to penetrate so long into the French lines that they actually lost connection with their own side. And speaking of Germans, they were not all evil. They were just normal people, most of them. And we have to look at how the Germans were turned from normal people to something else. And the reason I say this is if we look at how a democracy turned into a dictatorship, and how propaganda was able to turn the minds of so many, and how a lot of them had to be shown anti-propaganda after the war to try and make them normal again. And it's really important today as well, as we can see how people get their news from like only Facebook or only one set of news, and how they are turned into something that we don't recognize, a person we don't recognize, and how we can see the same rhetoric going on from back then to today. And that is also important to remember, since if we don't learn from our mistakes we made before, or we don't try to learn from it, then there's no reason to record history at all. And propaganda is still one bad tool, because it really can make everything worse. And it's a tool that have become available for every person around the world due to our internet and social media. We also need to talk about how a lot of people believe that the only reason Germany lost in Russia was due to the cold and harsh winter month. And it is true that during the war there were a lot of cold winters, and the Germans had not planned for it at all. But it wasn't the winter who actually stopped them. It was Hitler giving new orders all of a sudden, the September rain who made the ground so muddy that they couldn't move along. And they actually began to move again when frost set in and the mud froze. And then a lot of the fighting began to happen. And it is true, the cold winter weather did not help at all, but it was not the winter's fault. But we are told that it was because of the winter, because it's a remnant of German propaganda, that's the only reason why they were able to lose to Russian soldiers and tactics, is because the weather was what with the Russians. And by doing that, they don't acknowledge how many Russians actually fought to their death, how many died bravely trying to stem the advance of the Russians, or all the human civilians that actually burned down everything they owned so the Germans couldn't get any supplies, no food, no shelters, nothing. The Russian people suffered a lot during that time, and they did a lot, both soldiers and civilians. But for some reason, it's always the winter who ended the German advance, even though it was not only the winter weather. And there is so much in history we don't see, and we really need to see the truth in history and get an image of something. And we also have to look out for something that might not be true. So it's also a good thing to actually look up who made the documentary, who made the reports, and what country made it, so we have an idea of the bias that they put into the report. I've said this before, but if you watch a documentary from different countries, you can see how they portray the same thing in different ways and show you different facts, because they want to make themselves look good and not the other side look good. And it's something we have to remember, because if we don't remember that, we actually have to remember we have to see our country in a bad side to learn from it. And it's really important to learn from history, the bad sides and the good sides, because history tends to repeat itself. And I know it can be hard to be told that your country used to be evil, used to do bad stuff. But if we don't talk about the bad stuff that happened, then there is a chance of it repeating itself, since we won't be able to see the warning signs when they are approaching us. And if you don't believe we don't learn from history, just look at the pandemic of the coronavirus and how they actually used a lot of the same rhetoric from the Spanish flu, who didn't originate in Spain but in the USA, but was called the Spanish flu because the Spanish news weren't censored like the rest of us, so they reported on it. But we learned from history there that self-isolation and mask actually helped a lot, and how it made the numbers drop a lot all over the world. And then 100 years later, we have totally forgotten those lessons, and we don't believe the lessons, even though history proved that the lessons are true. So to understand ourselves, our history and our country, we need to remember to see all of it, not just part of it. And it's the same with our personal story. You don't become the person you are just from the bad stuff, also from the good stuff. You have to see it all in one connection. And maybe you did some bad stuff, but as long as you learn from it, then you have actually achieved something good. So I do hope you like this episode. And if you do like this type of episode, there's more of history in my podcasts, and you can find it everywhere you can find podcasts, basically. You can also find me on YouTube, and you can come chat with me on my social sites, Reddit, Facebook, Instagram. And I just want to wish you all a very nice day.